It was a sunny afternoon when a black biker, minding his own business, cruised down the highway, unaware that his ride was about to take a dangerous turn. What started as an ordinary day would soon spiral into a situation that would ignite an online firestorm. For this biker, the road was supposed to be his escape, a chance to feel the wind in his hair and the freedom of the open highway. But instead, he was about to become the target of something far darker than he'd ever imagined. As he approached a quiet stretch of road, a police officer, seemingly out of nowhere, pulled him over. At first, it seemed like a typical traffic stop, but something wasn't right. The officer's attitude quickly went from routine to aggressive. His questioning was suspicious, his tone hostile, and most shockingly, it became clear that this wasn't just about a traffic violation. This officer was making it personal. The biker couldn't shake the feeling that his skin color was the reason for the sudden escalation. As the situation began to unfold, the officer's behavior became more overtly racist. His words were cutting, his accusations baseless. He kept insisting the biker was breaking laws he clearly wasn't, throwing out remarks that made no sense at all. But what he didn't expect was the biker's reaction. Unwilling to stay quiet, the biker began recording, capturing every moment of the tense interaction. In that instant, a battle for justice began, one that would unfold in the court of public opinion, with the power of social media amplifying the truth. This wasn't just one man's story. This was about a system that often targets people of color unfairly, and how technology is giving those voices a chance to be heard. As the video spread online, the backlash against the officer was swift and unforgiving. Thousands of people across the world were outraged by what they saw, calling for accountability. The officer's actions were being scrutinized from every angle, and soon his career would be hanging by a thread. But the story doesn't end there. While the officer faced mounting pressure, new revelations started to surface about his past, things that made this story even more explosive. And the biker, now at the center of this viral storm, was left wondering what would happen next. Would justice be served, or would this just be another story of a person of color getting caught in a system designed to hold them down? The fallout was just beginning, and as the tension built, everyone was left wondering, what would be the final outcome of this explosive encounter? Would the officer face consequences, or would he find a way to dodge responsibility? Stay tuned, because the truth is more complicated than anyone could have imagined. As the video of the police stop went viral, the tension between the biker, the officer, and the wider community only grew. People were starting to question everything: the officer's motives, his history, and whether this was an isolated incident or part of a much bigger pattern of racism within the force. News outlets picked up the story, and it quickly became one of the top trending topics. The outrage was palpable, but so was the fear. For the biker, this wasn't just about one bad interaction. This was about something far bigger. His story echoed countless others, stories of Black people being treated unfairly, pulled over for no reason, or being harassed simply because of the color of their skin. But there was another angle to this story, one that wasn't getting as much attention. The officer at the center of this storm wasn't just any cop. He had been with the department for over a decade, and while he had built a reputation for being tough on crime, there were whispers. Whispers from colleagues, from people who knew him outside of work. It wasn't uncommon for the officer to cross lines, little things that didn't always get reported, but when you added them up, it painted a troubling picture. He had a history of making racially charged comments in private, of stopping people for minor violations, and escalating situations unnecessarily. Some people had even called him a bully with a badge. But none of this had ever been enough to get him disciplined. The system had always looked the other way. Until now. As the pressure on the officer mounted, he went into damage control mode. He denied everything, claiming that his actions were justified and that the biker had been uncooperative, even threatening. He stood by his version of events, painting himself as the victim in this situation. The officer's supporters rallied behind him, citing his long track record of service and dedication to the job. But many could see through his defenses. It was clear that his behavior wasn't just a slip-up. It was part of a bigger, systemic issue. The more the officer dug in, the more of his story began to unravel. Meanwhile, the biker was finding himself at the heart of a movement. People from all walks of life, from all over the country, were supporting him. Some were demanding that the officer be fired. Others were calling for wider police reform. The biker never expected to become a symbol for change, but now his every move was being watched. While part of him felt empowered by the support, another part felt overwhelmed. He had no idea how this would end, and with each passing day, the weight of this situation grew heavier. The officer, on the other hand, was trying to maintain his composure, but the backlash was starting to chip away at him. His phone was flooded with threats, his colleagues started distancing themselves, and his credibility was being questioned at every turn. But the real bombshell came when an anonymous source leaked documents showing that the officer had been under internal investigation for months prior to the incident. These reports revealed that the officer had been involved in several questionable incidents, including using excessive force in previous stops and making racist remarks during interactions with civilians. It was a smoking gun, but what would happen next? The department could no longer pretend they didn't know. With mounting evidence, the pressure to take action was immense. However, just when it seemed like the officer might finally be held accountable, the story took an unexpected turn. In an attempt to shift the narrative, the officer went public with an unexpected confession. In a press conference, he admitted to some of his past mistakes, but claimed that the interaction with the biker had been blown out of proportion and that he was simply trying to keep the peace. The apology seemed hollow, though, and many believed it was just a tactic to save his career. His supporters rallied behind him, accusing the media and activists of sensationalizing the event. The public was divided, and the tension reached a boiling point. The biker, however, wasn't backing down. He continued to demand justice, using his platform to speak out about the larger issue of racial profiling and police brutality. He was tired of being part of a system that treated him like a second-class citizen, and he knew this wasn't just about one officer. It was about the culture within the police force that allowed officers like him to get away with these actions. His courage inspired others to come forward with their own stories, adding fuel to the fire. As the case against the officer seemed to gain momentum, something unexpected happened that shook everyone to their core. Just as the community began to believe that justice was finally within reach, the officer made a shocking move. He claimed that he was the one who was being targeted, that the entire incident had been a setup. His defense was flimsy, but it gave his supporters a new narrative to rally behind. The question on everyone's mind was the officer about to escape the consequences he deserved? Would the truth come out, or would the system once again fail to hold him accountable? With both sides digging in their heels, the battle for justice was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, and no one knew who would come out on top. The clock was ticking, and as tensions escalated, the stakes grew higher. Would the biker get the justice he deserved, or would the officer slip away, his actions unpunished? With the community at a boiling point, one thing was clear. The story was far from finished, and the outcome was hanging in the balance. As the drama continued to unfold, the tension in the community was almost unbearable. The officer's shocking claims of being the victim only fueled the fire, with supporters and detractors alike digging in their heels. The biker, however, wasn't backing down. His voice was louder than ever, and as more people came forward with similar stories of police misconduct, the pressure on the department to act became undeniable. But just when it seemed like everything was reaching a breaking point, an unexpected twist turned the whole case upside down. A former colleague of the officer, who had long been silent about his actions, decided to speak out. This whistleblower, someone who had worked with the officer for years, came forward with startling revelations. According to this source, the officer had been involved in even more disturbing incidents than anyone had realized. But it wasn't just his actions on the job that were troubling, it was his personal beliefs. The whistleblower revealed that the officer had been part of secret online groups that promoted racist ideologies. He had even shared messages about targeting people of color, using his badge to intimidate and harass anyone he deemed suspicious. This bombshell revelation was the final piece of the puzzle. The officer's actions were no longer something that could be dismissed as a bad day or a misunderstanding. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was nowhere for him to hide anymore. Public outrage reached a fever pitch, and the officer was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. For many, this was a long overdue moment of accountability. The biker, though, was still uncertain about the outcome. While he knew the officer's career was in jeopardy, the bigger issue still loomed large: the systemic racism within law enforcement. He realized that this one incident, as important as it was just the tip of the iceberg. As much as he wanted to believe that the officer's downfall would lead to lasting change, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Real reform was needed, and it wasn't going to come easily. But something remarkable happened in the days that followed. The case had sparked a national conversation about police conduct, racial profiling, and the need for accountability. The support for the biker grew, and communities across the country began to rally for change. Protests, petitions, and calls for reform flooded in from every corner of the nation. People from all walks of life, black, white, and everything in between, were united in their demand for justice. Then the department made an announcement. The officer would be terminated, his badge stripped away, and his actions formally condemned. It was a victory for the biker, but more importantly, it was a victory for everyone who had ever felt the sting of racial discrimination. The officer's termination was a symbolic win, a step toward holding those in power accountable for their actions. But as the biker stood in front of the cameras, he knew that the battle wasn't over. The fight for change had only just begun. In the end, the officer's downfall was a reminder that justice, while slow, can be achieved when people come together and demand it. But it was also a reminder that the real work lies in dismantling the systems that allow injustice to persist. The biker had been the spark, but it was the collective power of the people that fueled the fire. And as the story came to a close, the biker walked away not just as a symbol of resistance, but as a catalyst for change, knowing that while this victory was important, there was still so much more to be done. The lesson from this story is clear. The fight for justice is long, and it's not always easy, but it's worth it. Sometimes it takes one person speaking out to start a movement, and sometimes it takes a community coming together to make real change. The fight against racial injustice isn't over, but it's far from lost. And while the officer's fate was sealed, the greater fight for fairness, equality, and respect for all people continues.